So Keenan's gone. Brandon. Megan is here, but her face is gone now. No more picture of you.
Yes.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, that's cool. I got a picture. You did. No.
This is my smallest class. All right, here we go. So, does everyone have the inside over the break? These page numbers have the thing for the DBQ read for Tuesday? And I gave you the extra credit?
What? Yeah. Yes, you did.
Extra credit, we're good? Everyone happy? I know it's going to be tough being away from me for 5 days. I know. Trust me. I'm fortunate. I'm with me all the time. But you guys, I know you're You said that? I have a beer stick, and I'm not afraid to use it. As we all know, in the 1970s, there was a real effort to change the United States to the metric system, and it failed because many people thought it was, I swear to you, this is the truth, in communist law. So with that, the Cold War was fun. Let's go. So, what was the rebellion in 1831 that would lead to stricter slave codes and Nat Turner? And I should not have. And yeah, I did this, and I was playing with, and he did a new screen. Yes, and I did that with a pen once, but I left a mark.
Now I can tell you.
Did I tell you how I broke the overhead? My second overhead? I was like, through it?
What number is this?
Well, no, that was I knew. Yeah, that's the one before that broke. And by the way, why did I do that? Somebody. So, also, 1831 was the 1831. What was the newspaper that William Lloyd Garrison started? The Liberator. Yep. What did Douglass start? What newspaper did Frederick Douglass start?
We don't know yet.
Oh, we didn't get to that?
No.
I thought we got to Frederick Douglass.
No, William Lloyd Garrison.
North Star. Did we talk about slavery, moral equality, white republic? And Douglass started the North Star. He was a former slave, ran away. He was a household help, ran away after he was beaten, as he saw, for completely no reason, even though he thought the whole thing was horrific.
What's his first name?
Frederick. He ran to the North, and he would write his own autobiography and use the proceeds to buy his freedom. We should also show you the whole thing about slavery, like when they would sell their kids and everything else, about the idea that this was civilizing was just a joke. It was all about money. The whole thing was about getting rich and then using racism so they could continue their power and their position. And it goes on to this day. But Douglass would be a tireless fighter for equal rights. Remember, what was the Women's Rights Convention in 1848?
Seneca Falls.
He was at Seneca Falls. He was at Seneca Falls. And during the Civil War, not only would he first push Lincoln and the North, the United States, to make this a fight for freedom, but one of his biggest things he wanted, do get this down, is to have black soldiers fight. He wanted black soldiers to be recruited and black soldiers to fight, not just be laborers behind the line. How could they ever say that former slaves don't deserve to be citizens if they fight and die for their country? That's what he thought. As it would turn out, you'd be surprised what people would say, but that's what he believed. That would prove that they earned citizenship, and would be a tireless fighter for equal rights and fighting against power. Frederick Douglass is a pretty amazing guy. I love the name of his newspaper, the North Star. I keep on wanting to just grab it. Take care of business. What? So, we're going to jump right to, it's no coincidence that in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion, so we're right to here. A lot of abolitionists they believed in this idea of the American Colonization Society. And that would be to free slaves, but remember, make this a white republic. So send them, and they want to say back, which makes no sense, but freedom to Africa. They'd send them back to Africa. But remember, almost all the slaves were second, third, fourth generation in the Americas, and most of them had no idea where they were from in Africa, their ancestors. This was an insane idea, but it shows its racism, and this is in the capital of the country they created in Africa in 1824. Monrovia, after President Monroe, what country did they create? You can see it right here. Liberia. Liberia, for liberty. Liberia. And that would be one of the two remaining independent countries in Africa when World War I began in 1914. Liberia and Ethiopia, the rest of them have been conquered. And the problem was, they convinced enough Africans, this was propaganda to convince people of African descent who were free, to willingly go to Liberia. But, this would be a garden spot, you'll be back home. But it wasn't their home. And they became kind of the rulers. The descendants of slaves who came to Liberia became the rulers over the people who lived there when they got there. And so they set up this own kind of like class system there. And Liberia's been unstable their entire existence. They've had many civil wars, 3 in my lifetime. In fact, the mayor of Helena fled Liberia when he was young because of the Civil War. He came to Montana. There's been a couple students here, and now he's running for Senate in the state of Montana. But that's the connection to Helena. And so that's Liberia. Abraham Lincoln, as late as the end of 1862, thought that sending former slaves to Africa was a good idea. Then it was over 4 million people, and it was insane for lots of reasons, and also forced people who grew up in the Americas also to throw them in Africa. But still, a lot of people thought that. So we're coming to them. We've gone through slavery, issues of abolition, racism. Let's set up in that last decade before the Civil War, known as the fiery 50s. And you'll notice I wrote down so like a new heading for this section. You also notice here, the fiery, I put it in red, like fire. Pretty cool, huh? Who's this guy? John Brown, who become one of the most polarizing figures in American history. And my yearbook photo for years. Yes?
So is this still like part of the 10?
Yeah. So with that, this is review. This is review. Remember the Mexican cession, Taylor was just elected president, California wanted to be a state, a free state. And that would trigger now a decision on what to do with the Mexican cession. So Taylor, who had no real position, even though Charles Sumner, a Whig abolitionist from Massachusetts, would turn out to be one of his most important advisors and friends. Remember, Taylor was a slaveholder and a soldier from Louisiana. Taylor came up with an idea, and his idea was this. And he was very linear, concrete, not a deep thinker. If the problem is slavery in the territories, the whole problem is whether or not the federal government will establish slavery in these territories so they become slave states. Let's just get rid of the territories thing. This is a big area, isn't it? California wants to be a state. Well, there's not enough people if you break this up, so let's just make a really big state here called New Mexico. Just create 2 states. Problem solved. We avoid the issue of slavery in the territories by just skipping it. So this cartoon is trying to show Taylor trying to balance between northern and southern congressmen. I will solve the issue. We'll just skip territories, no reason for civil war. But Taylor also stuck in his head that we're going to let the people here who live there right now decide whether or not they'll be free or slave. And these places didn't have slavery. So they would be 2 free states. 2 free states. And Taylor was convinced that would solve the problem. And as you can imagine, Southern congressmen were like, what a good idea, let's discuss this. What did they immediately throw? Secession, which meant civil war, exactly. Because everybody knew that secession equals war. It's inevitable, because the US cannot survive if a country leaves. It will collapse, so that means war. And a new group of younger, more radical congressmen.
What do you mean if a country leaves? You said the US can't survive if a country leaves?
I don't know what I said, but if the US, if a state secedes, then the country's done. The country can't survive. So with that, a new group of Southern congressmen, senators and members of the House, who, as they saw, we can no longer back down, and they would get the name the Fire Eaters. Edmund Rutland was a congressman from Virginia. He best known for his long white hair, and he would supposedly light the cannon that opened up the first shot at Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War. The leader was probably William Yancey of Alabama. He's still a hero to a lot of Alabama politicians. And then James Mason of Virginia. Now, these are all pictures taken in the Civil War, so they're a little bit older in these pictures than what they were in 1850. But all of them thought we have to use secession to prevent actions by the North. And this is the big thing you have to get down. They believe this. Get this down. We have to make preventative moves. Preventative. We must prevent what the North or the U.S. might do down the road. We have to stop them today because they might do something tomorrow if we don't stop them. The problem is, if you do that today, how do you know the future? And so this is pretty risky. And what's their tool? Secession, which means civil war. And so Yancey's leading this group, but what do they say? If you have two free states, it's civil war. And Zachary Taylor says, okay, I will lead the army personally. And immediately, overnight, there are fistfights on the floor of the United States Senate. People started bringing knives and guns during debate. It became common. While one person was giving a speech, someone would stand up, a member of Congress, and open up their coat and show a knife or a gun to threaten them. The cloakroom, where they call it the cloakroom, where it implies where they hung their coats, but in reality it was like a smoking room, turned into a literal brawling area. They just would go in and just start fighting, and they would branch off and come together and push and shove. This is the floor of the U.S. House and the Senate. It got really violent overnight. And, jump the gun. So, Henry Clay, who's getting quite elderly right now. In fact, this is a good picture of him. It's his last photograph you ever took of him. Notice the very wry smile, right? Always have that smile. Henry Clay realized I'm probably not going to be a president. So his idea was, I'll come up with, I so badly want to, a compromise that will solve all the country's problems. Not just the Mexican cession, will solve everything. And his legacy will therefore be, I saved the country. Henry Clay. Taylor was immediately opposed to it. And he would dub this bill the Omnibus Bill. Omnibus means the bill that covers everything. And Taylor meant this as an insult. He's opposed. My plan or no plan. Once Taylor got his mind around something. They still use the word omnibus today. Today, if there's like a spending bill that covers a lot of different branches of government, they'll call it the omnibus spending bill. So it just means covering everything. And this is the bill. Now, I'll give you the main points. There are 5 main parts. The second part, just leave a hole because it's going to change. But I'll start right here. So first off, California free. California wants to be a free state. It'll come in as a massive free state. Yes. Yes. They were the same thing. And Taylor just called it the omnibus bill as an insult. And the reason that it was Clay's idea.
But it was
No, Taylor called it the omnibus bill to insult. He said, oh, you're trying to get everything under this one bill and it's going to fail. But they soon started calling it the omnibus bill. Everyone did.
Who passed this? Or like who came up with the bill?
Clay.
Clay? Oh.
So California free. Next, leave a blank here. Because a lot of abolitionists and free soilers are fears that you have slavery in the nation's capital. We should get rid of this horrible institution. Which, of course, the whole capital is built on slavery. I think I told you this before, but every federal building at this time, they still make them this way when they would make new ones, like during the New Deal, are decorated with what looks like little flowers, but they're tobacco leaves. All over the Capitol and all these buildings, little flowers with tobacco leaves, obviously made by slaves, would be the context. Now, next, New Mexico and Utah would have popular sovereignty, aka they would be open to slavery. And that means slave codes. Popular sovereignty, remember, that's let the people decide. So two huge territories. These are massive territories, but not quite like the state of New Mexico. Next, a tough fugitive slave law that citizens must assist in the return of fugitives. Fugitives were runaway slaves. And the Constitution says states must return fugitives. It doesn't say the word slaves, it says fugitives. But southern states were saying, many northern states, up here especially, were shielding fugitives. And then lastly, to finally totally resolve the Texas border and debt issue. That was the least controversial of these issues, even though Texas was furious. They nearly went to war with U.S. dragoons in Santa Fe. But here's the problem. Clay thought everyone is going to have to give up a little bit. They have to give up a little bit. We'll pass this compromise, and we'll come together as a nation and save the country. Which, by the way, that never really happens. And there's something else. Free soilers looked at these two laws and said, no, we won't vote for this. Southerners looked at these ones, especially the fire eaters, and said, no, we won't vote for this. And what happened by early June 1850? With Taylor opposed and divided, the bill wouldn't pass. The bill was stuck. It was not going to pass. Fire eaters wouldn't vote for California free, 1 and 2. Northerners, free soilers, wouldn't vote for 3 and 4. So here's Clay, a famous painting of him, supposedly giving the compromise of 1850. But the thing was, Clay would not compromise. Back in 1820, Clay broke up the Missouri Compromise into 2 bills so it could pass. He refused to do that here. Refused. And so, it would not pass. And here's a fight, Robert Anderson, or Jackson, I'm sorry, and Thomas Hart Benton actually got into a fist fight, and Jackson pulled out a gun against Bennett in the floor of the United States Senate. It literally looked like war. And then Clay decided it's over. It's over. We're done. Clay, absolutely distraught, in early June went back to Kentucky. And Clay sincerely thought that the country that he had fought his entire life for to preserve, because there were a number of times about didn't make it, was done, was over. Clay went back thinking he has failed. It was miserable. His bill hung, not passed in the United States Senate. This was his lowest moment, and he was thinking, I didn't have much time and I failed. And he was right. Yeah.
What was the 5th one about Texas?
The Texas border. You know what that is? That's a death mask. And these are really common before photography, but the tradition remained. If you didn't, if someone you loved or cared for died, the idea would be, well, you would make a mask of their face so you can remember what they looked like. Because if you don't have a picture, how would you remember? And even though they had photography by then, it's the tradition remained. So when Clay died, they put a plaster mask over his face. And you notice the grin? Even in death, he had that grin. That's actually that must have been his resting face. Look. Is that exactly the same? Year and a half later, that's it. Clay is gone. Daniel Webster, the great Whig, even though I know I call him a great Whig, but doesn't he look like an angry owl in that picture? What do you think? Very owlish. Webster, who was from Massachusetts, the Whig from Massachusetts, got up and said, we must drop our sectional differences. In fact, with a famous statement, he comes here not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but an American. But it was too divided, and it would not pass. And Webster, who had been in Congress for 30 years, he was also Secretary of State, he was in Washington, D.C. his whole life. He, too, was near the end. Within a year of that speech, that's his death mask. And then a senator came in against the compromise. In fact, he was so ill they had to carry him in on a stretcher, and they leaned the stretcher against the speaker's podium, and they tied him to the stretcher so he kind of could hang there. In fact, this man was so ill, he couldn't even read his speech. James Mason of Virginia read his speech. You may know what that was. Where's my mouse? Huh? It's John C. Calhoun. Wait. Look at that finger. There's like 8 joints there. Do you see it? He came up, and in his last speech that he was too ill to read, he said 2 presidents, a Northern president and a Southern president, each with the power to veto to protect slavery. But if there are 2 presidents, would anything ever get passed? If you want an example of how that works, look at the United Nations, where 5 countries have a veto and nothing happens because it's too easily vetoed. And so that was his plan. The only way to save the Union is to let the South do what they want, because if the North threatens slavery, there'll be civil war. Now, Calhoun didn't want this, but that's what he said. And by the way, what's that in his hand? He's strangling a kid. No, he's not. Look into his eyes. Look into his eyes, people. Do you feel it? Do you feel it? It's boring a hole into your soul. Poetry. And neck hair. And Calhoun, as awful as he still did not want civil war. And yet he too knew it's nearing the end. That is his grave in Charleston, South Carolina. It's near the Episcopal Church, and they locked the church because people, for what I argue very good reasons, come in to face this grave. But I want you to imagine something. You're going to a really dark and stormy night. Maybe you're trying to get to sleep kind of fitfully. You hear noises, hear things at night. So just you're uncomfortable. It's kind of a gloomy evening, pitch black, and then all of a sudden you wake up and you see this. Now that's a death mask. Why would you want that? You don't want that? So Calhoun also died. The thing about it is now it's fire eaters in the South. That's who's in charge. And Northerners are getting tired of being bullied. Zachary Taylor's still president, and he refuses to compromise. Good picture? I wonder if that's his last picture. And the July 4th celebration in 1850, many people thought it was the last one. Taylor actually went to this in his full dress general's uniform, implying he's ready to lead the army in case there's civil war. That is a bad sign. By the way, this nice wool uniform would have been very comfortable on a July day in Washington, D.C., with the average temperature 1,000,000 degrees. It keeps the heat out. Remember, I told you that. You go into the jungle, we're all wool hat, bundle up. The heat, it just radiates out. That's science. You'll thank me. Also, there's something like, I did it. Okay, so, and in this miserably hot day of speeches and presentations and bands playing, Taylor went back and had his most favorite treat, even though he wasn't feeling good. He hadn't been feeling good for a few weeks. It was chilled cream and berries. That is an actual picture of what he ate right before he ate it, the actual real picture, with the new invention of color film. That's 70 years away. But, by the way, what's chilled cream? Ice cream. You had ice cream. How'd you make ice cream in 1850 in July in Washington, D.C., pre-electricity? Carefully. You would know? Yes.
You have to like stir it and mix all this stuff, right?
You stir it, mix all the stuff, and it turns into ice? Is that how you make ice? I didn't know that. But you need ice first, and then you stir the cream. How'd they get ice in 1850? I had this for a reason. Turn the camera off. So, no, in the winter they would go to lakes and cut off chunks of ice, big blocks of ice. Then they'd store them in an underground insulated place called an ice house. So you'd have ice in the summer. Not for a lot of reasons. Then you can put it in ice and you mix everything up and spin it.
So they use lake water?
Hmm?
They use lake water?
Yeah. Hey, they were clean waters for weeds. But let's get back to this. He was already feeling bad. That evening, something didn't agree with him and he got a stomach ache. The next day, he had a high fever, started going in and out of consciousness, had hallucinations, and then went into a coma. And five days later, Zachary Taylor was dead. And you want to see it? You want to see it? I don't have that. So with that, but a lot of people said he might have been even assassinated. There's a whole conspiracy theory about this to try to get the compromise passed. But it's certainly not true. Some people said he might have cancer or other issues. It's almost certain he died of the same thing that Harrison died of and Polk died of a month after he left office. Do you remember? Cholera. Cholera. Almost certainly. And that is why I am so tired of clean water. You people have got it easy. Right? Every time you get a drink, you should have it just like other people, like people of my generation have. Might get cholera, might get immediate dysentery, parasites. Come on! I'm so tired of you people having nice things while I have the summer. Who's going to save the country? Who's going to step into the breach? Who might come back to save the country?
Oh.
Who was that one guy's name?
You want to know?
Something Davis.
Raoul C. Calhoun,
Wait.
John's brother. So with that, neck hair, a little heavier, he's got glasses. So, Raoul C. Calhoun. His brother was actually in Cuba at this time, and he's totally made up. But
Oh.
he's made up. But, which, by the way, is a pretty good picture, right? Former student of mine made that. That's pretty good. So, with that, Raoul C. Calhoun, in cahoots with the reanimated body of George Washington.
I was wondering why it was.
Millard Fillmore was no hero and not a very effective president, but he was more open to compromise. And with Clay gone and virtually everybody else gone from Washington, D.C. that summer, Stephen Douglas, the little giant, he's about 5'5", the little giant from Illinois, he came in and his idea of a compromise. And what's his compromise? It's a good one. Break up the bill. Just like Clay did back in 1820 for the Missouri Compromise. This would give him great prominence. So, look back at the bill you already wrote down. Remember you already wrote down the 4? So,
Thank you.
he broke up the bill. So, California free, they kept that. But there's a change for number 2. And the change is this: the slave trade. And that's what you have to add to what you already wrote down. The slave trade. Everything else would be the same. The slave trade. Now, they could have no more open slave markets. Slavery still exists, but it gave the image. So the only problem was a lot of Northerners, especially abolitionists, were like, you did nothing with this. And Southerners were like, if slavery is legal, why can't we have the slave trade? But still, that was one law, one bill, and it passed with Northern votes. And then the very controversial popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico, They took out the word popular sovereignty and said they could write their own constitution, meaning the same thing. So, Utah, New Mexico, popular sovereignty. You don't need to write the extra parts down, but that's just popular sovereignty. But that means open it up to slavery. They opened up the slavery. Next. Oh, this passed Southern votes. And then this passed a little bit, mostly South, and all South and a couple Northern votes. Just write, you already have down the Tucker Fugitive Slave Law. I'll add a little bit later. So just write, you already have that down. And then Texas Board. So, North, South, a few North and South. It passed. It's not like a true compromise where everybody gave something to pass the bill, but in parts it passed. And by the way, it almost never happens. The idea that you get people from different points of view coming together and vote. In fact, almost never. It's hard to even come up with it. Eventually someone in power, and they'll just have to pass a law. And if people don't like it, they get them out of power. Well, a couple things about this. Was it successful? When the bill was signed, the champagne came out and the guns were put away. There was hugging and cheering. I mean, they literally were thinking, we saved the country. Did it save the country? It didn't prevent civil war, but did it save the country? We're still here. But it didn't stop civil war. In those 10 years would be decisive for the North. Decisive. In 1850, the South would have won the war. And they almost won 10 years later. But they would have won in 1850. But with more people in the North, but especially industry, represented by railroads. I've showed you this once before. Here's 1850, and look how much more track and therefore more industry and in the North by 1860. That would be decisive for the victory of the United States. The Compromise of 1850 did not prevent civil war, unfortunately. But by pushing it back 10 years, the North could win. One more thing I do have to add, open up these areas to territory, or open up these areas to slavery. And in Salt Lake City, the Mormons, who had the majority of the now new territorial legislature, they decided to stay. And that means they're going to have to obey federal laws. Brigham Young personally would propose the bill in this new territory that would ban plural marriage. Remember, that was one of the big issues that's in West. And slave codes. Utah Territory got slaves. Now, they were very poor, so they didn't have a lot of slaves, but they opened up the slavery, which was interesting from an abolitionist church, but that's how Utah stayed in the Union. They had to ban plural marriage and get slaves. So,
There's a show called Sister-in-Law. I don't understand. Isn't there still plural marriage happening? Or those are
those are areas then that have essentially been kicked out of the LDS church. They've been kicked out.
So are they not?
They're huh? Yeah. Clintons. In fact, there's a whole, a lot of those groups moved to Mexico. These were Mormon children were a group of mostly Mormon. They were immigrants in Mexico, and they were attacked by Mexican drug lords. Yeah, they were ones who believe in plural marriage in Mexico. Yeah, so it still happens, but they're not part of the mainstream church now.
Okay.
So,
and are the marriages like illegal, or are they just like set up?
No, they're not illegal. I mean, they're not legal. No.
Okay, so they don't have a marriage license.
They usually have like for one, and then they.
I realized.
So in 1852, this presidential election was pretty anticlimactic. Don't even worry about the free syllabus. I'm sorry, Hale, Senator Hale, but they had lost the last 4 years. Basically, okay, it's solved now. So the Democrats would run Franklin Pierce. And Pierce, and the Whigs tried one more time with the general. One more time. The problem was, old Tippecanoe worked. Old Rough and Ready worked. Do you remember what Winfield Scott's nickname was? Yeah, old Fuss and Feathers just really doesn't have that appeal. And Pierce was a Northern Democrat who favored the South. In fact, they had a name for it. I wrote it up here on the board. He was a doughface. A doughface. Is that light flashing again? It goes on and on. Or is it totally dead? But dough face, and it's really weird. You know what dough, like bread dough, is kind of white. And so the idea was, and I know this doesn't make sense, I'm just telling you how they came up with the reference in 1850. He had dough on his face, so he's a white face like the white republic in the north. But if you take off the dough, it's a black face for the slave republic in the south. Even though he's not for the lives of slaves, but that's where they get the term dough face. And Pierce would win a resounding victory. A resounding victory. The Democrats rode the popularity of the Compromise of 1850. Not that people liked the Compromise of 1850, there just wasn't civil war. A huge victory. A victory like this will not happen again for a very long time. But Pierce himself was not very popular. Yeah?
Did you say that he favored slavery? Or
Yeah, he was pro-slavery, but he's a Northerner. He wanted policies to protect slavery, a better way to look at it. And Pierce was already probably an alcoholic, but his wife died right after he was elected, and that turned him into an absolutely raging alcoholic. And he was already going to be greatly flawed anyways, but his presidency is considered one of the worst presidencies in history. In fact, the next president, James Buchanan, would also be one of the worst. I guess it kind of almost makes sense that right before the horrific Civil War would be two of the worst presidents in history. One other thing about Pierce, his great-great-granddaughter was Barbara Pierce, who would marry a man by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush from another very wealthy family. And George H.W. Bush would become president would be elected in 1988. So she would become first lady. So Franklin Pierce's great-granddaughter, and then great-great-granddaughter, and then her son, Pierce's great-great-great-grandson, would be George W. Bush, who would be president when you were born. So that's the connection with Pierce. Very wealthy family. Yeah?
Who was the free soil candidate?
His name was John Hale, but they would not get many votes. And the thing was, sure, they avoided civil war, but things were still very violent, personified with the most popular book of the century, written in that decade, would come out, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a book about the bravery of slaves, the horrors out of that system, and their attempts to raise the freedom, which had great meaning because of the new Fugitive Slave Act. Harriet Beecher Stowe would write this book, and if you were caught with this book in the South, what's going to happen to you? There were a couple of people who were lynched in the South because they had this book. Yet it would be an international bestseller. And Stowe would write this, even though she had never been there, it had enough accuracy along with being well written for the time. You notice I said for the time. It's hard for us to read today. It's a hard book to read, but then it was incredibly popular. I'll come back to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that showed the anger in the North that was already brewing by 1852 about the fugitive slave law. Now, I put this in the wrong order. So Northern states said it infringed on state laws because it forced Northern states to do something, even if they had laws in opposition to this. So it infringed on state laws. And this was to return runaway slaves. And do you know what a posse is? So think about there's a criminal on the run. A posse are citizens who are getting temporarily deputized to help run down the criminal. My idea of this is always in Westerns from the 1940s and 1950s. There'd be a posse to run down the bank robber. And what it meant, the fugitive slave law said this: every adult citizen, in this context, an adult citizen meant a man, had to join a posse to capture a fugitive, which means a slave. If they don't, they can go to jail. So if you don't want to run down a so-called fugitive slave, even if they're a free person who's being, what does a fugitive slave look like in the North? Wouldn't that look like a free person? So they would just kidnap people and say they're a runaway slave. Just kidnap them. And so you had to join. That's a big restriction on your personal liberty. And then judges would decide, local judges. And for their administrative costs, judges would be paid $5, which was a pretty good hunk of money then. if they found them to be a free person, and $10 if they found them to be a slave. Doesn't that sound like it's rigging the system to kidnap people and send them south? I mean, we like to think that judges are all honest, would never do that, but judges tend to be humans. So it seemed like bribery. Northern states were furious at these laws. That's where you get this caution, colored people kidnappers and slave catchers. That's in Boston in 1852, the same year as that election. So the same year, one more thing I have to add, the second most popular book in this decade was about a northern free man who was kidnapped years before this, but it came out at the same time. He was kidnapped and sent to the South and sold into slavery. Brutal slavery, then made it back to the North. It was called 12 Years a Slave. And it was the second most popular book of the 1850s. A couple years ago, they made this into a movie. And it's about the slavery. Has anyone seen it? It's rated R, so you get your parental approval. Always got to add that for R-rated movies, but it's brutal. They show slavery. They show what as close as they could get. It was probably significantly worse.
What's it called?
12 Years a Slave. They show it. And so with that, northern states started passing personal liberty laws. And personal liberty laws were laws just simply violate federal law. Now to northerners, we're following our state rights. Southerners went nuts. By the way, I'm not kidding about 12 Years a Slave. It's a really good movie. But boy, it's brutal.
It's on Netflix.
I don't think so. It was really popular. It was nominated for a number of Academy Awards. I think one a couple. It shows it. So, but the Southern viewed this was a direct attack on their way of life. You are violating our system. And in fact, they started saying that northern states with these personal liberty laws will harbor runaway slaves, arm them, and start a slave rebellion. And so they started saying, you're depriving us of and the cry became states' rights. That's what Southerners said, that we demand our states' rights to have slavery. Now you can make the argument, wait a sec, doesn't this violate states' rights by forcing people to join a posse? But states' rights was the code. It never really meant rights for states over the federal government. It meant, get this now, pro-slavery.
What was the personal liberty law? Did that just...
For northern states, so they could basically go around the Fugitive Slave Act. I can't even begin to tell you how angry southern states were. So states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. But states' rights was code for do anything to protect slavery. Use the federal government, state government, anything to protect slavery. States' rights will come back in 1948 and would be around for over 20 years. And in 1948, it would come to mean no civil rights. Blacks will not have equal rights in the United States. That's what states' rights meant. We're going to keep our laws of segregation called Jim Crow laws. It'll come back in 48. So with that, a couple more things real quick. First one, filibusters. Filibusters that's another word for like freebooter or another way to say a pirate. These were southern thugs. I'm not kidding, just thugs who went down to, I should have put Central America, I put out Latin America. But they went down to basically Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and tried to overthrow the governments in these countries here, get the U.S. to annex them as what kind of states? Slave states. Most famously, William Walker right here, he even took over Nicaragua for a while and tried to make it into a slave state. He would be overthrown and executed. But these are filibusters. And so literally take over a country. While that's going on, in the U.S. Senate, especially Southern senators, were using the power of Senate rules that senators can give a speech as long as they want. Unlimited debate in the Senate. So one senator could capture the floor of the Senate and not allow any bill to be passed by giving a speech. And they began to call that the filibuster. And that's what that is today. It comes from there. Yeah.
Isn't that still? Yeah.
Even though now they don't even do the speeches anymore. It's just the senator just has to say, I'm going to filibuster, and they vote to end it. And if they don't have the 60 votes to end it, they just move on to the next thing, it stops any bill. That's why nothing happens in the Senate. Nothing. So, one more thing we have to get from this. It's called the Austin Manifesto. And what it was is the United States, yeah.
Is that why you don't think Donald Trump will go through this one? Like the impeachment?
The impeachment's outside of that. Because the impeachment is actually not Senate rules, that is in the Constitution. But it still requires 2/3.
Which would be really hard.
Really hard. That would have to be, if every Democrat voted for it, it still would require 20 Republicans, and that's a lot.
Is there more Republicans than?
They have a slight majority. And the Democrats have a big majority in the House, so that's, you get this. So back to this. The Austin Manifesto, basically issued by the U.S. Secretary of State Buchanan, but just have to know that this is talking about the U.S. taking Cuba and making it into 2 slave states. So Northerners are looking at this like, wait a second, they won't quit. They want to invade countries. They won't quit. They're bullies after slavery. And here's Buchanan surrounded by a bunch of filibusters. He was the Secretary of State. And so the point is, why I mentioned these 2 things, behind the scenes after the compromise, the country appeared to be falling apart, and that would be personified by the biggie, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen Douglas, in 1854, he wanted to become president. He needed a big victory. By the way, that's a bad picture of him. He's called the little giant because he wasn't very tall. But by looking up and pointing up, makes him look shorter. Because you look down to increase your stature picture.
What was his first name?
Stephen. Democrat from Illinois. And he wanted, they called it the Transcontinental Railroad, but it's basically to connect the eastern railroads to the Pacific. He wanted a northern route. It doesn't seem that north to us, but across Illinois to San Francisco. But do you see the problem? Before that can happen, these unorganized territories need territorial governments. And what compromise said no slavery north of 3630 in the Louisiana Purchase? From 1820, the same bill that Clay broke up, the Missouri Compromise. So, Douglas put up a bill for his railroad that said 2 free territories. And what did the fire eaters do? They threatened civil war. And Douglas made a deal with the devil. You want to guess what the deal would be? That is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it said, it repealed. I don't know why I didn't write repeal. Lastly, just put down repealed the Missouri Compromise and Nebraska and Kansas territory would be property opened up to slavery. And it would pass. And this ignited the whole country. By the way, you're sitting in Nebraska territory. So for about 7 years, you're sitting at an area that technically was a territory open to slavery. Most people don't think of Montana for very obvious reasons to never be a slave state. Technically it was, even though not many citizens of the U.S. lived in this area. Hey, try your best to get through Thanksgiving, okay, guys? It's going to be hard.
What was the thing?
Oh, look at them.
Who was the guy who did?
James Buchanan. And he'd be the next president.
He's the secretary of state.
Yeah. I'm constantly checking the weather because I have to drive to Miles City tomorrow.
Hey, I'm going to Mount City too.
You are?
Yeah.
Where are you going?
Tomorrow.
Spend Thanksgiving there?
Yeah.
She gives me like tennis.
So with your grandparents? Probably a bunch of people.
Well, I don't necessarily live there anymore, but we got a lot of friends there.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah. And we're gonna go hiking.
That mountain, you know, it's okay.
Yeah.
It was a lot different when I was, you know,
All you wanted to do?
there was more money and it was, like the downtown used to be a nice little downtown and now it's pretty sad. You know the area where Walmart was and all that? When I was your age, it was basically farmland.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's about 2,000 more people living there. It's still fine, but it's just not the same.
Yeah, I don't really feel at home there. I mean, it's my dad's house.
Yeah, I'm sure he loves it. It's kind of neat. And I'm sure he takes you around those, I went to this place, you're like, yeah.
We always go to that airplane.
Airport Inn!
Love that
So-
place.
Yeah, that was my favorite place as a kid, the Airport Inn.
Yeah, that was me.
We might go there on Friday night, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll probably be going there sometime.
So I might see you there.
Yeah.
Enjoy Miles City. I know, it'll be tough to leave. There's some people are tough here. Miles City, right?
It's not real person. How many people are here today? Yeah. There is not one. Why is your class going?
Oh, we're still filming. Uh-oh. We might not have filmed anything. Oh, well. By the way,